Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I am Léa de Haute and I have with me Lucas Galdicas, who will present the summer outlooks, and Alban Joyot, who is the adequacy manager here at ENTSO-E. So now let's look at the agenda. So after a brief introduction to set the scene on the summer outlooks, Lucas will present the results and will focus more specifically on the hydro reservoirs levels. Then we will take a short break and there will be a Q&A session. So please don't hesitate to send us questions in written form, or if you prefer, you can also ask them orally by raising your hand. You can see in the tool a little hand button, and then we will unmute you. What are the seasonal outlooks about? So the summer outlook looks at the role of interconnection. It looks at external factors, so the weather, market condition, and consumer behavior. It is a sensitivity analysis looking at severe scenarios, also so 1 out of 20 years. And it also includes the review of our outlook for the past season. So the results for the summer 2018-2019, or winter 2018-2019.
Hello, everybody. So thank you, first of all, Leah, for a nice introduction and setting the scene. And thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. So my name is Lucas Galdicas, and I'm adequacy analyst at ENTSO-E. And today I will present a Summer Outlook 2019 results. To start with, first of all, I would like to set the scene of various products of ENTSO-E. And here we see a sort of temporal scale of it. So at the very left side hand, we have a 10-year network development plan product, which looks at the long-term distances, like more than 10 years or 10 years as well. And the main purpose is to support some policy decision making and to support also investment decision making on the heavy infrastructure objects. Following that, ENTSO-E also releases midterm adequacy forecast report, which focuses in the time frames up to 10 years. And the main purpose is to support decision making on some investment decisions and some other policy decisions, which can lead to some corrective measures for the adequacy in the midterm time frame. Later on, we have a seasonal adequacy assessment, which will be presented today for the coming summer. And we focus for a 6-month ahead adequacy assessment to support operational decisions. So for example, it could be such operational decisions can be supported, such as maintenance optimization or reallocation, and also preparing for adequacy mitigation actions in the near real-time time frame, which is actually investigated in by the regional security coordinators with a week ahead adequacy assessment, which you see on the very right-hand side of this slide. And this assessment checks if for the coming week there is any risk for adequacy in the system, and if yes, the coordination of mitigation actions are taken in that frame. So as you see, there are various products in different time frames, and of course further in the future we look, the uncertainty increases. So seasonal outlook, it's somewhere in between and bridges the midterm adequacy assessment and week ahead adequacy assessments. So once again, just the focus today will be on the seasonal adequacy assessments, and more specifically summer 2019. So what does it consist of? So first of all, what we do is we gather the data from all the TSOs and some pan-European databases when a consistent data sets and consistent methodologies to prepare them are needed. So we do our best to ensure that the whole data set used is consistent on the pan-European scale. After this, once we get all the data, we proceed with assessing adequacy under European constraining scenarios, and we do it for two let's call it so, scenarios, or two assessments. So one is on the left-hand side, written as synchronous peak adequacy assessment, which is denoted as upward study. So during this study, we check if the available generation would be sufficient to cover demand. Of course, we take into account the available interconnections and possible imports to the countries which needs the imports for the adequacy. And we define as the most constraining scenario is typical Wednesday at 7 p.m. When on the pan-European scale, it has the highest residual load level, meaning that the highest generation is needed in Europe, typically on Wednesday 7 p.m. And if we check that available generation are sufficient, we assume that there is no risk for the adequacy. Furthermore, we also perform a downward regulation assessment, which checks if all the renewable and inflexible generation could be absorbed, let's say, by demand. In other terms, we check if the system operators would need to curtail any of the renewable generation in our system, or maybe the renewable generation would be it would be possible to consume it for consumers, or in not worst case, but in case if national demand would be not sufficient to consume all this energy, if interconnection availabilities would be sufficient to export to the neighboring systems. So having these two assessments, we perform European assessments under the constraining scenarios. Lastly, what we focus on is we analyze each week for the coming season, and we check which week is most constraining, and then we do a more detailed analysis with probabilistic simulations. So we draw a numerous number of possible temperature, wind, solar generation scenarios. And under many different circumstances, realistic circumstances, we check if there would be any adequacy risks in the system. And if adequacy risk exists, we try to identify what is the probability of such a risk. And furthermore, we also try to understand the main drivers of the risk. And so, in other terms, under which circumstances the risks may exist. So this is a typical assessment approach of the seasonal outlooks to identify any potential risk for system operations for the coming season. What we would like to stress is that under the upward regulation assessment, or adequacy assessment, in other words, if we identify any of the potential risks, it doesn't mean itself that there would be definitely some load shedding in Europe. What we try to understand, what we try to assess, is that if in the day-ahead time frame there would be enough of resources in Europe to supply all the demand. If there is enough of resources in the system, we assume that there is no risk for the adequacy, unless some, of course, unexpected or let's call it crisis scenarios in the system, which we cannot assess in advance well. So, however, given all the realistic possible scenarios, if there is enough of resources in the system, we assume that there is no risk for load shedding. On the other hand, if we identify some risk, we have to keep in mind as well that it doesn't mean load shedding itself. It only means that some other corrective measures can be taken. For instance, activation of strategic reserves in the system could be performed in such a way. Additional resources are brought to the operations and which can serve demand. Furthermore, out-of-market demand-side response can be activated to do the same thing. And only after all these measures are exhausted, some partial and controlled load shedding might be performed, but it would only affect a very small amount of, typically it would affect only a small part of the consumers in the system. So to wrap up this slide, the main message is that if we identify some adequacy risk in the system, it doesn't mean a blackout in the system, nor it doesn't mean necessary demand shedding itself. It means just that some intraday measures will have to be taken, and if they're not sufficient, then just some demand shedding would be necessary. So to start off with Summer Outlook 2019, what we typically do is we review the evolution of Europe's generation mix. And we also compare it to the change compared to last summer. And what we noticed this year is that net generation capacity increase doubled in Europe. What we mean here is that net generation capacity last summer was recorded of around 11 gigawatts, which is on the left side bar. If we sum all the increases and then deduce it by all decreases, we get 11 gigawatts. While this year it increased rather a lot, and it reached more than 20 gigawatts. Of course, we have to keep in mind that most of the increase is contributed by renewable and renewable generation capacity evolution, and which doesn't replace conventional generation or one-on-one in general. And furthermore, we observe once again a continuous decrease of the coal generation capacity in the system, which is a long-term trend in Europe already. What we do as a following step, we check hydro reservoir levels in early spring before we perform any assessment to assess the hydrological conditions for the summer. Though we have to note that the current methodology used for summer outlook does not consider energy constraints for the coming season, which is a target of the future improvements, and we hope to implement it as soon as possible. However, this overview already indicates if additional attention should be paid for the hydrological conditions in Europe. And our findings for coming summer were that in most of the Europe, hydro reservoir levels are roughly on average. We could highlight maybe the situation in Switzerland and France, where on one hand in Switzerland the reservoir levels were on above average levels, while on France is below average levels, though which at the end still contributes to the situation that in most of Europe hydro reservoir levels are on historically average levels. Furthermore, in some parts of the Alps, there are high levels of snow, which also indicates that during the summer, hydrological conditions, at least around the Alps, should be okay. So given that the hydro reservoir levels are on average, we proceed with quite high confidence on hydro generation contribution to the system adequacy, and we performed our simulations for adequacy assessment. So here in this presentation, we showed the results of our study. So on the left hand side, you see a table with our assessed zones in our study in each row. In the columns, we have denoted indexes of weeks we assessed. So we assessed in the Summer Outlook 2019, week 22 to week 39. And for each of this week, we perform simulations. What you can see is that each cell is colored according to the simulation results. If the cell for specific week and specific zone is colored in green, that means that in that week, country has more generation than expected demand under severe conditions, which means relatively high demand given all possible scenarios. If the country is colored in light blue, this result suggests that country would have enough of generation capacity to supply its demand. However, it's very likely that cheaper generation would be available abroad, and country would be importing to supply the demand at the pan-European synchronous peak demand time, which is 7 p.m. as mentioned a bit earlier. Furthermore, if the cell is colored in blue, dark blue, it suggests that country would be required to import some of generation in order to ensure that all demand is supplied. And here you can see also a number of this kind of cells, and this is also a quite normal situation, and in some study zones is a long-term trend, which does not indicate that it's a bad adequacy situation. It just means that country is reliant on structural imports, and it simply means that it's very likely that they have enough of import capacity. And lastly, if there would be some adequacy risk for the coming summer identified in the Summer Outlook 2019 study, we would have colored part of the cells with orange bars, depending on how much of demand would be not supplied. Luckily, for this summer, we don't identify a significant risk for adequacy in any SS zone. Though, of course, extreme circumstances or more similar towards a crisis scenarios could result in some adequacy issues. Though under most realistic scenarios, this is unlikely to happen. What we highlight in this year's summer outlook is the situation in Italy and each specific zone there. So in Italy, we assess each zone separately. And all together, so it's not study zone by study zone assessment. It's a pan-European study where the whole pan-European region is assessed at once. So we assess adequacy situation in each specific zone in Italy, where it's typically most concerning during the summer period. What we notice is that this year adequacy situation is looks better compared to the last summers. However, we also observe that supply margin is rather tight in week 30 due to some maintenance works on generation units and some and the general situation in Europe. Therefore, we focus more to investigate this week in details and perform probabilistic simulations for week 30 in summer 2019. And you can see our assessment results briefly here. And what we depict here is actually that given that we perform probabilistic assessment with numerous possible scenarios in week 30, given all possible temperature scenarios, wind generation, PV generation, outages, and so on, we noticed that to have a deficit after imports, which would mean some need to activate remedial actions in intraday time frame, for instance, we don't see this kind of risk in our assessment. So what we notice is that, as usually, central Italy, which is denoted here by IT02 and IT03, needs imports through almost in any possible scenarios. Furthermore, we also see that the northern Italy needs also quite in the possibility that northern Italy needs imports is also quite high, which is let's say a bit higher probability compared to last year, at least what we observed. So under these most critical scenarios, it is worth that the regional cooperation would be performed closely, especially on week 30, and focusing on Italy bidding zones, specifically marked here with high needs of imports, simply to make sure that those imports would be available from the neighboring systems or neighboring also bidding zones. Said that, I would like just to mention that with these results, we would like to wrap up all the results and just in brief mention what is foreseen for future seasonal outlooks. And for future seasonal outlooks, of course, we have to implement all the requirements listed in the clean energy package, especially focusing on the risk preparedness regulation. So for this, ENTSO-E is developing methodology of identification of electricity crisis scenarios, based on which national risk preparedness plans should be built. And also we are developing methodology for short-term and seasonal adequacy assessments, which would also be a significant improvement compared to today's methodology. Though, of course, we do our best to assess adequacy as accurately as possible. Nevertheless, they mentioned requirements in the regulation of methodology, so we strive to perform adequacy assessment as accurately as possible, taking into account all possible factors which may impact the adequacy in the system. On the second point, we also strive to extend coordination with week ahead adequacy assessment to make sure that our assessments are as aligned as possible and that we exchange information in between of ourselves. on one hand, we exchange the results, what we find towards them, and also get some risk which they identify in the week ahead time frame that we could also pay attention in our simulations in the future. So really, this is a key activity for us. And the third point is, of course, to set a scene for future seasonal outlook full probabilistic modeling, which would take all the which would overcome all the limitations of the current modeling. So we could perform hourly assessments and also take into account in many. So that would be all the presentation points from me. I don't know, Leah, now how we proceed.
Thank you, Lucas. So now we take a short break, 5 minutes. So please use this time to send us your questions. So you can send them in written form, or you can raise your hand later on and we will unmute you. So see you again in 5 minutes. Okay, so we have received 2 questions. So maybe Lucas, if you want to start with the question from Davor.
Okay, so yes, I see a very interesting question, of course, from Davor, and the question actually sounds like, how do we incorporate seasonal weather forecast in the Summer Outlook 2019? And more specifically, it's focused on the rest generation and demand. So the situation is that we start seasonal outlooks or few months in advance before the actual summer, because it involves a quite large number of the TSOs to deliver the data, also to perform the modeling and then to assess the results. So like this time it was started around February, March, and at this time frame there are not really many weather forecasts, or we cannot have reliable weather forecasts for long-term time frames. So we assume or we assess all possible weather scenarios in our simulations, or in this case, under the severe conditions, we consider 1 in 20 years extreme situation, which would mean that we consider 1 in 20 years high demand for each week, and also 1 in 20 years low renewable generation for each week. So this is our typical approach to assess adequacy in the summer outlook. I hope that I answered your question. Of course, if you would like to ask something more in details, then please do it in the question window, and then I will try to come back to this question once again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lucas. So another question by Sami on Italy's adequacy risk in week 30.
Thank you, Leah. Yes, so I would like to then stress once again the results of the adequacy assessments in Europe for the coming summer. So we didn't identify a specific risk in any of the countries nor Italy's bidding zone. Our results suggested that there is enough of generation capacity available in the system during the summer to supply demand under severe conditions. And also, in case there is not enough of national generation capacity, country has enough of the capacity to import from abroad, and in abroad there is enough of capacity to also supply this demand. So we don't really identify any risk. Though what we noticed is that during the whole summer, week 30 has tightest supply, especially in Italy, and therefore we perform probabilistic assessment just to double check our results under severe conditions. And we just reaffirmed even with probabilistic simulations that by considering a numerous of additional scenarios, different weather scenarios, renewable generation, and also different demand scenarios, in Italy there would be enough of generation capacity or import capacity from abroad. And of course, in that neighboring system, there would be enough of capacity to supply this import needs to Italy. So yes, very in short, the adequacy should be okay, and only under unexpected scenarios, which could be denoted as more crisis scenarios, adequacy should be followed very carefully in week ahead time frame.
Okay. Thank you. Then we move on to a question by Francesco on whether we plan to use interlinked models in seasonal adequacy in gas crisis scenarios.
If I may, so in this time frame, what we don't see as a main focus at the moment. We do already consider gas energy, let's say, availability as such during the winter outlooks. So we are in close cooperation with ENTSO-E, who assesses the gas adequacy in Europe. And we check the gas availabilities there, and we try to identify if there would be any impact on electricity adequacy assessment. Though what we also believe is that these lack of gas resources, let's say, in the system, especially during the winter, is usually assessed as a supply route disruption, which could be seen more as a crisis scenarios. And in the future, these risks could be assessed in the electricity crisis scenario assessment more than in the frame of seasonal adequacy assessment, because it's really more as an exceptional situation which may occur, while in the seasonal adequacy assessment we try really to focus on all possible or realistic scenarios for the coming season.
Thank you. I have one last question from Rainer, who asked whether we take into account the possibility of a very hot summer to cool nuclear power plants.
So this is indeed what we try to do with our severe adequacy assessment scenario. So we try to really consider extreme weather conditions, which may lead to, first of all, of course, high demand due to cooling in the system. Also, low wind generation, which are quite common during the hot days. And we also take into account that it could be also low PV generation to make sure that we don't miss any risk under severe conditions, as well as under the severe conditions we consider that it could be extreme low generation availability of the thermal units, especially coal and nuclear as well, due to low levels in the rivers. And this is actually already considered in our assessment. Of course, we don't, we at the moment at least, we don't consider a crisis scenarios, let's say, of the large-scale nuclear unavailability or coal units unavailability, which could affect a extreme number of units. So under the severe conditions, we consider a significant impact on those units as well.
Thank you. So I have two more questions now. So another one from Sami: do scenarios take into account the trips of key generation units?
Yes, thank you for this question. Indeed, so we consider it given the forced outage rate assumptions in our simulations. So it's not our scenarios does not consider only key generation units in Europe. We consider, let's say, all of the biggest units in Europe, or neglecting only some small power plants connected maybe to distribution system. But all the other units are considered in our simulations, as well as the possibility of the forced outages of those units as well.
Okay, thank you. And Sami also asked whether the scenarios take into account drastic market price variations of coal market, etc., that could change the merit order.
Yes, that's also an interesting question. Indeed, CO2 prices and many other variables may have impact on the merit order, especially when, at least in the short term, when we see this small gap between coal and gas generation prices. However, we don't pay extreme attention to these factors because it would not really affect the adequacy when all the generation units would be dispatched in our system, nevertheless of their place in the merit order. So we don't really focus on these aspects in our assessments.
Thank you. And one last question from Davor. He asked, what about CO2 prices and Brexit uncertainty that could influence the rise of electricity and gas prices?
Yes, so once it's very linked actually to the previous question, so we don't really consider the price variations, first of all. And regarding Brexit and uncertainty, even if Brexit, we of course paid attention to some extent to the possibility of no deal Brexit and what could happen, and actually our member TSOs took some action. So, for instance, Elia, RT, Tenet, Netherlands have a bilateral agreement in case of no deal Brexit even happening in the near future. So even under such extreme circumstances as no deal Brexit, there are already agreements in place which would ensure safe system operations. So it should be it should not pose any adequacy concerns in Europe.
Well, thank you, Lucas. I do not see any other question. So unless someone wants to ask a question orally, but I don't think there is anyone, then I'll say thank you for following this webinar. Here are the key takeaways that you can see on the screen. So our seasonal outlooks are unique pan-European system-wide security of supply analysis. We continuously improve the methodologies and the cooperation in between TSOs. For this summer, we expect the system to be adequate even under severe conditions, and the levels of hydro reservoirs is average in Europe this summer. Then one thing you shouldn't miss out is that in July, we will launch the public consultation on the risk preparedness regional methodologies. So it will be announced in ENTSO-E's newsletters and on our public website. So please make sure to follow up if you want to take part in this consultation, and we really need your input. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you very much also for attending from my side as well. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.
Bye.